Rome wasn't built in a day, but it definitely burned overnight. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a flickering oil lamp, a marble hallway echoing with sandals, and a man in a toga wondering how exactly he ended up ruling a continent. So dim the lights, fluff your pillow, and let's slowly descend into the ruins of the Roman Empire, the place where emperors were worshipped as gods, then stabbed in the back by their bodyguards, repeatedly. This isn't your schoolbook version of Rome. No exciting battles, no screaming gladiators. Just a nice, long, mildly depressing look at how a city of sheep herders ended up shaping everything from indoor plumbing to fascism, and how it all got very weird very fast. Let's start at the beginning. Not of Rome the myth, because, spoiler alert, Romulus and Remus probably didn't get raised by a Volf. But let's roll with the story anyway. It's Rome. They loved a good origin myth. The twins, the Volf, and the vibes. So, according to Roman legend, the city was founded by two brothers, Romulus and Remus. And like all good foundation myths, it involved murder, a miraculous survival, and some aggressive urban planning. Born to a priestess who wasn't supposed to have kids, classic, they were tossed into the river Tiber, because that's how you solve problems in ancient mythology. But instead of drowning like most unwanted babies in history, they floated to safety and were naturally nursed by a she-wolf in a cave. As one does. Anyway, Romulus later murdered Remus. Sibling rivalry is just more permanent in ancient times, and named the city after himself, Modest. So Rome was born, through fratricide, animal rescue, and a healthy amount of ego. The earliest Romans? Pretty much farmers with attitude. Think muddy sandals, simple huts, and a burning desire to conquer everything in sight. But first, they needed some women. So they stole them. Literally. The rape of the Sabine women was not so much a love story as a hostile population merger. Rome's early diplomacy was mostly, marry us or we'll stab your dad. Romantic. Let's have kings. Wait, never mind. Let's never do that again. Rome started off as a monarchy because, why not? Everyone was doing it. But Roman kings were kind of a mess. Some were foreign, others were paranoid, and one was supposedly murdered by a flying book. Yes, a book. This was Servius Tullius, the sixth king, who either rose from slavery or divinely caught fire as a child, depending on how generous your source is. He ended up being murdered by his own daughter and son-in-law. Family dinner must have been fun. But the final straw was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, literally. Tarquin the Proud. Imagine naming yourself that and thinking you're the hero. He was the kind of king who ruled like a frat boy with absolute power, arrogant, brutal, and wildly unpopular. His son, well, he assaulted a noble woman named Lucretia, which led to her suicide. And Rome collectively decided they were done with kings. Like, forever. So in 509 BCE, the monarchy was out. Enter the Roman Republic, where they tried really hard to create a system of checks and balances, and where everyone, especially the wealthy, still found ways to rule everything, because of course they did. The Roman Republic. Democracy, but with extra stabbing. The Republic was built on a weird balance. 2 consuls, a senate full of rich guys, and some tribunes to pretend the commoners had to say it was all very noble sounding. But if you weren't rich, or male, or a citizen, good luck with that. Still, it worked. For a while, Rome expanded. They loved a good road, a nice aqueduct, a dramatic political scandal, and lots of war. Rome took war like it was a job interview, and they were overqualified. First they kicked out their neighbors. Then they fought Carthage not once, not twice, but 3 times. Because if there's one thing Rome hated more than a monarchy, it was a city that dared to have a navy. The Punic Wars were a mess. Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants? Iconic. Rome eventually burning Carthage to the ground? Very on brand. But behind the glory was a slow, creeping rot. Economic inequality, political corruption, and the worst possible solution to everything. Powerful military generals with loyal armies and no impulse control, which brings us to the man, the myth, the walking red flag. Julius Caesar. He saw. He undermined the Republic. Ah yes, Julius Caesar. A man so famous he permanently renamed the month of July? A man so extra that his dying words may have included dramatic Latin, or Greek, depending on how theatrical you're feeling. Caesar was born in 100 BCE to a patrician family, meaning he had the right name but not much cash. So naturally, he leaned into charm, politics, and some truly aggressive ambition. He climbed the ranks fast, became consul, got into the first triumvirate, which was basically a power-sharing situation between him, Pompey the Great, and Crassus, the richest man in Rome, whose whole vibe was, I'll buy everything and burn what I don't own. Anyway, Caesar went to Gaul in modern-day France and just sort of conquered it. He wrote about it in the third person too, because humility was not a Roman virtue. But when he got too popular, the Senate panicked. They told him to disband his army and come home. Caesar, being Caesar, crossed the Rubicon River with his army instead, which was a literal no-no. He basically declared civil war with a dramatic stroll. Eventually he won. He became dictator for life, which to Rome sounded a lot like king. Remember how they felt about kings? Yeah, so in 44 BCE, a bunch of senators, including his so-called friend Brutus, stabbed him to death on the Ides of March, on the Senate floor. In togas, democracy, nailed it. Rome, now with extra emperors, you'd think they'd learn. But no, Caesar's death led to more civil wars. Enter Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, who would later become Augustus, the first emperor. He was smart, careful, and knew how to market himself as not a king while doing very king-like things. Under Augustus, Rome stabilized. Sort of. He launched the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, which was peaceful if you ignore the conquest, slavery, and executions. And then came the emperors. Oh, the emperors. We'll float into that next, because if you think Caesar was dramatic, wait until you meet Caligula. Caligula, Nero, and the art of unstable governance. So we left off with Rome transitioning from, let us pretend we re-still a republic, to, okay, fine. It's a full-on empire. And at the center of this transformation was Augustus, the golden boy of Roman propaganda. He was careful, smart, and had the public image of a benevolent father figure. But the thing about setting up an empire is you eventually have to hand it off. And unfortunately, Rome didn't exactly have a great HR department for vetting successors, which brings us to Caligula. Yes, that Caligula. Caligula, the emperor who appointed a horse, whose real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, which, let's be honest, is a bit much. Caligula was his childhood nickname, meaning little boots, because as a kid he wore a tiny soldier outfit to please the legions. Cute, right? Unfortunately, that's where the cuteness ends. He became emperor in 37 CE at the age of 25, after the death of his great-uncle Tiberius, who was, let's just say, not exactly missed. Tiberius had spent the last years of his reign on the island of Capri, doing things so morally confusing that even Roman historians got uncomfortable trying to describe them. So the people were thrilled when young, charismatic Caligula took over. And for the first few months, he was surprisingly decent. But then he got sick, like probably very sick, possibly with a brain infection. And when he recovered, well, let's just say he was not the same. A very imperial breakdown, Caligula began seeing himself as a literal god, not metaphorically, not in a divine right of kings way, but in a worship me or I'll feed you to something with claws kind of way. He executed people on a whim. He threw lavish, endless parties funded by, well, everyone else's money. And yes, he allegedly appointed his horse Incitatus as a priest and almost made him a consul. Because when you lose faith in the Senate, why not try a horse? There were also rumors of incest, public cruelty, and delighting in watching people suffer. Some of this may have been exaggerated by hostile historians ... But even if 30% is true, it's still a pretty solid train wreck. Eventually, even his personal guard was like, okay, this is enough. And in 41 CE, Caligula was assassinated, stabbed in a tunnel under the palace by his own bodyguards. Honestly, very on brand. Claudius, accidentally emperor. Now, here's where it gets a little sitcom why. After Caligula's assassination, the Roman Senate debated whether they should just bring back the Republic. Radical thought, I know. But meanwhile, Claudius, Caligula's uncle, was literally hiding behind a curtain in the palace, fearing for his life. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite palace guards / professional kingmakers, found him, dragged him out, and declared him emperor. Just like that. Claudius wasn't exactly what you call imperial material. He had a limp, a stutter, and had mostly been ignored as the weird uncle at family dinners. But plot twist, he wasn't terrible. He expanded the empire, notably conquering Britain, and actually tried to make the government work again. He also married Agrippina the Younger, who was, wait for it, his niece. Because this is Rome and family boundaries were mostly decorative. Agrippina was ambitious, very ambitious. She wanted power for herself and her son from a previous marriage. His name? Nero, the musician who burned Rome. Let's float gently into the fever dream that was Nero's reign. Nero became emperor at the tender age of 16, and for the first 5 years, things weren't too awful. That's because the adults in the room, his tutor Seneca, the philosopher, and his mom Agrippina basically ran the empire. But then Nero hit his rebellious phase, which in his case meant slowly killing off anyone who tried to advise him, including eventually his own mother. Agrippina was reportedly stabbed after a failed attempt to kill her via collapsing ceiling, then poison, then boat. Creative, if nothing else. Nero fancied himself more artist than ruler. He loved performing music, writing poetry, and acting in plays, which was fine, until he forced the Roman elite to sit through hours of his performances and clap like their lives depended on it. Because they sort of did. Then came the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, a massive days-long blaze that destroyed much of the city. The popular rumor? That Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Historically unlikely. For one, fiddles didn't exist yet. And two, he was probably not that close to the fire. But the real issue wasn't whether he started the fire. It was what he did after. He blamed the Christians, a relatively unknown and unpopular group at the time, and started one of the first major persecutions. Executions, torture, public burnings, classic overreaction. Eventually, as rebellion brewed across the empire and people grew tired of his artsy dictatorship, the Senate declared him a public enemy. So Nero fled. And then, in 68 CE, with soldiers closing in, he took his own life, but only after famously saying, "What an artist dies in me," you know? Just in case we didn't realize he had a flair for the dramatic. Rome after Nero, the year of 4 emperors. You'd think this would be a good moment for Rome to take a break, drink some water, reflect, but no. After Nero's death, the empire immediately collapsed into chaos. In 69 CE, Rome had 4 emperors in 1 year. Yes, 4. It was like a speedrun of instability. Galba, old, serious, widely hated, assassinated. Otho, fancy hair, insecure, lasted 3 months. Suicide. Vitellius, popular with the military, eaten alive by politics. Also killed. And finally, Vespasian, a general with big dad energy who came in, cleaned house, and got things running again. Vespasian started the Flavian dynasty, gave Rome some stability, and began construction on something you might have heard of, the Colosseum. You know, that big oval where people were violently entertained for centuries. He also had a pretty great comeback for critics when he started taxing public urinals. Money doesn't stink. Classic Roman budgeting. Let's pause here in the arena, and that's where we'll pause for now. From gods in togas to emperors with performance anxiety, Rome had successfully gone from republic to reality show. In the next part, we'll float gently through the golden age of emperors, when things almost looked stable, before heading into the wild spiral of decline. Because no empire falls without making it very dramatic. Good emperors, who were good until they weren't so. Rome had survived the chaos of Nero's stage fright, the year of 4 emperors, and a series of very creative assassinations. Things finally settled down under Vespasian and his sons. He built the Colosseum, kept the economy from collapsing, and made "don't waste money" into an imperial motto, which honestly was probably the most practical thing Rome had heard in decades. After Vespasian came Titus, the guy who finished the Colosseum and had the unlucky timing of ruling during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. Imagine being emperor when half of Pompeii is buried alive and everyone's looking at you like, fix this. He did what he could, but he died young, probably poisoned, maybe just sick. Rome was never good at telling the difference. Then came Domitian, Vespasian's other son, who had trust issues, a persecution streak, and a tendency to remind everyone he was absolutely, definitely not a tyrant. Which usually means you are. He ended up stabbed by his own court. Because of course he did. The 5 good emperors after that, Rome had a surprisingly calm run. Historians like to call this the era of the 5 good emperors, which is kind of like saying 5 decent roommates in a row. Not perfect. But compared to Caligula and Nero, these guys looked like saints. Nerva old, sensible, didn't last long. Basically Rome's placeholder grandpa. Trajan, the empire's overachiever. He expanded Rome to its maximum size, stretching all the way into Mesopotamia. He also built a giant column of himself, which is still in Rome today, like the world's fanciest brag post. Trajan was admired because he actually seemed competent. When later emperors took power, senators would pray, "May you be luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan," which is basically Rome's version of, "Good luck being as cool as that guy." Hadrian, Trajan's heir. Hadrian loved travel, Greek culture, and walls, especially walls. He famously built Hadrian's Wall in Britain. Why? Because maintaining an empire that big was exhausting, and he figured, let's just build a fence and call it a day. He also had a famous love affair with Antinous, a young Greek man whose mysterious death in the Nile sparked a full-blown cult. Hadrian mourned him by naming cities after him and commissioning more statues than were probably necessary. Rome had never seen so much grief sculpted in marble. Antoninus Pius Hadrian's successor was, honestly, kind of boring, which in Roman politics was a huge compliment. He ruled for over 20 years without major drama, which is like a miracle for the empire. Think of him as the calm middle child of Roman emperors. Marcus Aurelius. Now we get to the philosopher king. Marcus Aurelius is remembered as the Stoic emperor, the guy who wrote meditations about life, duty, and accepting the universe as it is. Which sounds noble. Until you remember he spent most of his reign fighting endless wars along the empire's frontiers. Also, his son, Commodus, Rome's gladiator cosplayer Marcus Aurelius, made one very unstoic mistake. He broke the unofficial tradition of adopting a competent heir and instead handed power to his biological son, Commodus. Bad idea. Commodus fancied himself the reincarnation of Hercules. He wore lion skins, carried a club, and fought in the Colosseum. Not symbolic fights either. He actually stepped into the arena and demanded to be treated like a gladiator. Imagine the emperor forcing you to pretend to lose against him in front of thousands of people. Not awkward at all. He renamed Rome after himself. He renamed the months after himself. Basically, if he could slap Commodus on it, he did. Think of it like ancient branding, but with extra ego. Eventually, everyone got tired of his antics, and he was strangled in his bath by a wrestler. Which honestly was probably the most fitting end for a man who thought he was Hercules. From stability to a slow spiral. So the 5 good emperors gave Rome about a century of relative stability, art, philosophy, and competent rule. But then Commodus showed how quickly the house of cards could tumble. Rome's size made it fragile, its emperors made it unstable. And its endless cycle of assassinations meant no one ever really slept well in the palace. Next, we'll drift into the 3rd century crisis, the chaotic stretch where emperors were killed so fast you could barely memorize their names before they were gone. Because Rome didn't just decline. It performed its decline, slowly and very dramatically. The crisis of the 3rd century Rome's midlife meltdown. So, after Commodus, the empire went through a bit of a rough patch. And by rough patch, I mean absolute chaos. Historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century, which is a polite way of saying Rome completely fell apart but somehow didn't die. From about 235 to 284 CE, the empire had more emperors than a bad soap opera. Some ruled for years, some for months, and some for about as long as it takes to sneeze. The main cause? Assassination, usually by the army. Because the soldiers figured, why not just kill the emperor and make our guy the new emperor? This happened over and over and over. How to be a 3rd century emperor. A quick guide. Step 1. Be a general. Step 2. March into Rome with your army. Step 3. Get proclaimed emperor. Step 4. Immediately look behind you, because your own guards are sharpening knives. That was the cycle. One of the early victims was Emperor Severus Alexander, killed by his own troops because he wanted to pay off invading barbarians instead of fighting them. Apparently, the soldiers wanted action, not negotiation. So they stabbed him and put a big guy named Maximinus Thrax on the throne. Maximinus was intimidating. Supposedly over 8 feet tall, 8 barrels of meat, drank wine by the gallon. Basically Rome's version of the Mountain from Game of Thrones. But he never even set foot in Rome during his reign. He spent all his time on the frontiers, fighting and intimidating people until he too was assassinated. See a pattern? 50 Shades of Civil War, Rome split into chunks, literally, while emperors killed each other in the capital. Other generals broke off pieces of the empire to rule independently. There was the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and the actual Roman Empire in the middle, pretending it was still in control. Imagine your empire fracturing like a cracked plate, and each shard insisting it is the real dish. One bright spot was Queen Zenobia of Palmyra. She conquered Egypt, ruled Syria, and styled herself like a Roman emperor. Rome eventually crushed her rebellion, but honestly, she was way more competent than most of the men fighting for the purple at the time. Plagues, invasions, and inflation. Oh my. As if constant civil war wasn't enough, the empire was hit by plagues killing off millions. Invasions with Goths, Persians, and countless tribes pouring over the borders. An economic collapse where Rome's currency was so devalued that coins were basically shiny scrap metal. Picture it. Farmers abandoning fields, cities shrinking, trade collapsing, and people hoarding whatever looked like real silver. The empire was spiraling. Aurelian, the emperor who glued it back together, out of the chaos came one surprisingly competent guy, Aurelian. He ruled from 270 to 275 CE, which by crisis standards was basically an eternity. He crushed the breakaway Gallic and Palmyrene empires, reunited the Roman world, and earned the nickname Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. He even built the Aurelian walls around Rome, massive fortifications that said, yeah, maybe we're not invincible anymore. Better lock the doors. But of course, in classic fashion, Aurelian was assassinated by his own officers. Because Rome just couldn't help itself. Diocletian and the big fix finally, in 284 CE, a man named Diocletian took power. And unlike the dozens before him, he actually lasted. Diocletian looked at Rome's problems and thought, this empire is too big for one guy. Let's try 4. So he created the Tetrarchy, splitting rule between 2 senior emperors and 2 juniors, like an imperial group project. He also reformed the army, fixed taxes, and tried to stabilize the currency. Oh, and he launched one of the biggest persecutions of Christians in Roman history, because apparently balance sheets weren't exciting enough without some religious chaos. Still, his system worked for a while. And then he did something no Roman emperor had ever done before. He retired. Yes, retired. He went off to his villa in what is now Croatia and grew cabbages, literally. When people begged him to return, he said, "If you could see my cabbages, you wouldn't ask me to return," which might be the most relatable thing any emperor ever said. Drifting toward Constantine. The crisis was solved, sort of. Rome was still huge, still fragile, but patched together. The stage was now set for one of the most famous emperors of all, Constantine the Great, but we'll float into him next. Constantine the Great, the Christian, the marketer, so it's the early 300s CE. Rome is exhausted. The economy is limping along. Emperors are retiring to grow vegetables. And the empire, despite being held together with duct tape and discipline, is still somehow breathing. Enter Constantine, also known as Constantine the Great, or if you're into empire fanfic, the man who Christianized the West, founded a city, and rebranded an entire religion. He started as a junior emperor under Diocletian as complicated tetrarchy system, that whole 4 emperors, 1 empire thing. But surprise, 4 emperors all wanted to be number 1. Shocking. Cue civil war, again, because Rome loves tradition. Battle of the Milvian Bridge, with bonus divine vision in 312 CE. Constantine faced off against Maxentus, another would-be emperor, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome. Now, here's the fun part. The night before the battle, Constantine allegedly saw a vision in the sky, a glowing cross with the words, "In this sign conquer," which is either a miracle or the world's first successful marketing slogan. The next day, Constantine's troops painted Christian symbols on their shields and went into battle. And they won. Maxentus drowned in the Tiber, and Constantine marched into Rome as a hero, cheered not just as a victor, but as someone chosen by the heavens. No pressure. The first Christian emperor. Sort of. Now, technically, Constantine didn't get baptized until he was on his deathbed. So whether or not he was a true believer is still debated. But what he definitely did was legalize Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313 CE that meant no more feeding Christians to lions, no more setting them on fire for night lighting. Christianity was now a protected religion. And before long, it became Rome's favorite religion, whether you wanted it to or not. Constantine poured money into churches. He gave bishops power. He made Sunday a public holiday. And he called the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE to settle some doctrinal arguments, because Christians were already arguing about what being Christian actually meant, a long-standing tradition that continues to this day. Constantinople, Rome 2.0, but Constantine wasn't done. He wanted a fresh start, a new capital. So he looked east toward the old Greek city of Byzantium and said, "This'll do." He rebuilt it into a shimmering imperial capital and named it, shockingly, Constantinople. Modest, this new city had all the Roman grandeur without the messy Senate, crumbling temples, and old ghosts of stabbed emperors. It became the center of power for the Eastern Empire. And eventually, when the Western Empire face-planted into history, Constantinople just kept going for another 1,000 years. Because why let a good empire die when you can rebrand it? Legacy, Constantine's empire. Constantine's church. By the time Constantine died in 337 CE, he had completely redefined Rome. He didn't just legalize Christianity. He tied it to the empire. He tied himself to the church. And that set off centuries of complicated entanglements between religion and state. He also set the trend for imperial Christianity, where emperors ruled with a kind of holy backing, which would go on to inspire everything from medieval kings to modern political propaganda. And yet, Constantine was still very Roman. He executed his own son. He had his wife killed under suspicious circumstances. His court was full of intrigue and shadowy drama. So yes, holy symbols and all, but still, very on brand for a Roman emperor. Let's drift through the divide after Constantine. The empire was more divided than ever. There was now a Western Roman Empire and an Eastern Roman Empire. 2 courts, 2 bureaucracies, 2 emperors, sometimes working together, mostly pretending the other half wasn't imploding. and it's the western half that we'll gently glide into next. Because it's about to face a series of unfortunate events involving Visigoths, Vandals, and emperors who just wanted a day off. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, death by 1,000 invasions, and poor leadership. So, after Constantine shuffled off this mortal amphitheater, Rome officially had a split personality. The Eastern Roman Empire, run out of shiny new Constantinople, had money, walls, strategy, and most importantly fewer Germans at the gates. The Western Roman Empire, centered around Rome, Milan, and eventually Ravenna, had nostalgia and a growing sense of impending doom. From here, the story gets less like Julius Caesar, Part 2, and more like a slow, sad sitcom with too many guest invaders. Barbarians at the gates and the doors. And the roof. Let's clarify one thing. Romans called anyone outside their borders barbarians. That didn't necessarily mean unwashed savages, though. Yes, the PR wasn't great. It just meant non-Roman, usually from the north or east, and often speaking scary-sounding languages while waving spears. But here's the problem. By the late 300s, these so-called barbarians weren't just showing up for a fight. They were migrating. Entire nations, Goths, Vandals, Huns, Franks, Burgundians, the whole alphabet were on the move, pushed westward by population shifts, climate change. And one very aggressive man on horseback, we'll get to him in a minute. The sack of Rome, not just a metaphor anymore. In 410 CE, something happened that hadn't occurred in 800 years. Rome was sacked by Alaric, king of the Visigoths. He wasn't even trying to destroy the empire. He just wanted land and a title. Rome refused, so he marched in and took it. Now, this wasn't a fire and blood situation like later Hollywood would suggest. Alaric let his men loot, sure, but it was a pretty chill sacking by ancient standards. Churches were spared. No mass slaughter. Think of it more like an aggressive robbery with light destruction and a lot of shocked patricians. Still, the psychological damage was massive. Rome, the eternal city, the center of the world, had been breached. The emperor at the time, Honorius, was, mostly hiding out in Ravenna. Allegedly, when he heard Rome has perished, he panicked, thinking it was his pet chicken named Roma. Once he learned, it was just the city, he calmed down. Yes, that might be apocryphal. But it also feels very on brand. Meanwhile, here comes Attila. If you were hoping things would get better, I regret to inform you that Attila the Hun has entered the chat. Attila was called the Scourge of God, which is ancient speak for, this man is terrifying. He led the Huns, nomadic warriors from the Eurasian steppe, and made a career out of devastating Roman territories. He invaded the Eastern Empire, ransacked the Balkans, then turned his horse toward the west. In 452, he approached Rome itself. And what did the Western Roman Emperor do? He sent Pope Leo I out to negotiate, and it actually worked. Attila turned back. Whether he was paid off, impressed, or just bored is still up for debate. The point is, Rome was spared again, and the people celebrated like they'd been saved by divine intervention. Again, Attila died the next year, possibly from a nosebleed on his wedding night, because history has a sense of humor. The Vandal sack. Second verse, slightly worse, in 455 CE, Genseric and the Vandals sacked Rome again. This time it wasn't quite as gentle. They stayed for 2 full weeks, carefully looting anything that wasn't nailed down, including artwork, gold furniture, and probably several dozen confused senators. Still, it wasn't a burning down the city moment. The Vandals were surprisingly professional about their destruction, just very thorough. And yes, this is where the word vandalism comes from. Because we love a good linguistic insult. The last emperor, Romulus Augustulus. Yes, that's his real name. By the 470s, the Western Empire was less empire and more regional management office. The army was full of non-Roman mercenaries. The economy was barely sputtering. The emperors were puppets, sometimes kids, sometimes figureheads, always expendable. In 476 CE, a dramatic general named Odoacer finally said, "Okay, enough." He deposed the last Roman emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus. Romulus Augustulus, a name that tried really hard to echo Rome's founding and glory days, but ended up sounding like someone playing dress-up in Grandpa's armor. Odoacer didn't even bother killing him. He just retired him with a pension and sent him to live in the countryside. Honestly, the kindest end any Roman ruler ever got. And that, officially, is when the Western Roman Empire ends. But wait, it's still not over, because the Eastern Roman Empire, or as we now call it, the Byzantine Empire, just kept going. Same system. Same bureaucracy. Still calling themselves Romans. For another 1,000 years. So the idea of Rome, the laws, the Latin, the coins, the roads didn't die. It just moved eastward into new clothes. New crosses. New emperors with shiny titles and worse problems. But the old city, the heart of it all, Rome had fallen. Not with fireworks, but with decades of slow, careful crumbling. So Rome fell in 476 CE. That's what the textbooks say. Last emperor in the West gets retired. Barbarians are running City Hall. The aqueducts are crumbling. The forums are mostly pigeons now, but Rome didn't really die. Not completely. It just quietly rebranded. Let us take a nice slow float through all the weird ways the Roman Empire still lives with us today, right under our sandals. 1. Roman law. Still cluttering courtrooms worldwide, Rome had a thing for order. They loved laws. Loved writing them down. Loved carving them into stone and waving them around like divine mandates. They had laws about lawsuits. Laws about priests. Laws about public fountains. Probably even laws about goats. The big one was the Justinian Code, compiled in the Eastern Empire centuries after the Western half had folded. And that thing became the foundation of civil law in much of Europe. France? Spain? Latin America? They still echo Roman legal structures. And yes, if you've ever sat through a painfully slow legal procedure or read a government form written in suspiciously vague Latin, now you know who to blame. 2. The Latin language, officially dead, but still talking Latin is technically a dead language, and yet it's everywhere. The Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian are all evolved versions of Vulgar Latin. That's the casual, street-level Latin the average Romang actually spoke, not the fancy Senate kind with all the declensions and rhetorical flourishes. More like, you want fish sauce? 2 denarii. Even English, which is Germanic at heart, couldn't resist Latin's flair. Half our vocabulary? Latin roots. So if you've ever used words like maximum, exit, bonus, agenda, or etc., congratulations. You're halfway to being a late-stage Roman bureaucrat. 3. The calendar. Julius Caesar's time management scheme. Let's talk about time. The reason your year has 365 days, a leap year, and months with weird names like October, that somehow means 8 but shows up as month 10? Blame Rome. Julius Caesar introduced the Julian calendar in 46 BCE, because the old Roman one was a hot mess of moon cycles and political manipulation. The Julian version added structure, logic, and just enough flaws to make future popes nervous. Later, Pope Gregory XIII tweaked it into the Gregorian calendar, which we still use. But the bones? Totally Roman. Also, side note, July is named after Julius Caesar. August is named after Augustus. That's right. 2 Roman emperors took over summer. Because of course they did. 4. Roman architecture. Still trying to look that fancy. Ever notice how so many modern buildings want to look like they were built by guys in togas? That's Rome. Domes, arches, columns, all signature Roman elements. Their designs weren't just stylish. They were functional, beautiful, intimidating in that we have taxes kind of way. Walk around Washington, D.C., Paris, London, even Vegas. All full of buildings trying to look like they could host a Senate debate and survive a barbarian siege. Oh, and stadiums. Like your local football coliseum? Guess where that came from? 5. The Catholic Church, Rome with crosses and incense. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, something had to fill the power vacuum. Enter the Catholic Church. It borrowed everything from Roman administration, the hierarchy, the Latin language, the robes, the titles. Even the Vatican is built right on old Roman turf. The Pope, basically an emperor in religious cosplay. Bishops ruled regions like governors. Cardinals became the new Senate. And the whole thing ran on Roman-style rituals, holidays, and bureaucracy. So if you've ever wondered how religion ended up sounding like a Roman courtroom with incense, there you go. 6. The Holy Roman Empire, a fan fiction project gone too far in 800 CE. Charlemagne got crowned Emperor of the Romans. This kicked off the Holy Roman Empire, which Voltaire famously mocked as neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. But that didn't stop them from trying. It was a medieval fever dream of Roman revival, German kings wearing laurel crowns and pretending they ruled like Augustus, except with more armor and far fewer aqueducts. Still, it proves the point. The Roman brand was strong. Everyone wanted to be the next Caesar, even if they had zero idea what Caesar actually did. 7. Everyday Rome, still in your pocket in pizza. Finally, Rome lives on in all the tiny things. Coins? Still a thing. Republics and senates? Still a thing. Roads with ridiculous straight lines that ignore geography? Definitely still a thing. Your pizza? Roman-style round sliced like a centurion's shield. Public bathrooms with plumbing? Roman idea. Wine with cheese while reclining and complaining about the government? Pure Roman energy. They may have fallen in 476, but Rome never left. It just quietly built a guest bedroom in the back of Western civilization and made itself comfortable. This section picks up where the last one ended. We were just gliding through the marvel of Roman aqueducts. They built aqueducts, giant stone highways for water. Miles and miles of them. Silent, steady, curving across hills, sloping just enough to keep the flow going without flooding everything in sight. It's easy to forget just how absurdly advanced that was. Rome didn't just bring water into cities, they regulated it, measured it, divided it between homes, fountains, public baths, and sometimes that one rich guy's personal garden who just had to have his own decorative waterfall. They had lead pipes, which, yes, is a health nightmare now, but back then, it was engineering genius. Roman cities had more consistent water access than most places did 1,000 years later. You could walk through the forum in your sandals, toss an insult at a senator, and grab a drink from a public fountain all without dying of thirst or dysentery. And where there was water, there were baths. Oh, the Roman baths. These weren't just places to get clean. They were the original combination of spa, gym, library, and political talk show. Everyone went to the baths. Rich, poor, old, young, mildly drunk. It didn't matter. You could exercise, get a massage, hear the latest gossip about the governor's mistress, or sit in the hot room and stew in your regrets alongside 30 other half-naked men trying not to pass out. It was communal. It was ritual. And it was very Roman functional, but excessive. Some bathhouses were enormous, entire city blocks, with vaulted ceilings, painted walls, marble columns, and underground heating systems. Yes, underground heating. In the 3rd century, meanwhile, half of medieval Europe would later try to heat homes by setting straw on fire and hoping for the best. And when you were done sweating and scraping off the sweat with a strigil, which is exactly as glamorous as it sounds, you could stroll over to a latrine. Because, of course, Rome had public toilets. Dozens of them. Rows of stone benches with holes carved into them just casually out in the open. Because nothing says civilization like awkward eye contact while using the facilities. These latrines were flushed by running water. Continuous, cleanish water, moving beneath the benches in a steady flow. It's weirdly impressive, also deeply unsettling. But again, very Roman. Now, while all this water and infrastructure made life easier for many Romans, it wasn't exactly free. Someone had to run this machine. And more often than not, that someone was an enslaved person. Rome was, for all its grandeur, built on forced labor. Slavery wasn't just common, it was everywhere. From the men building aqueducts to the tutors teaching noble children how to recite Homer while pretending not to notice the wine breath. And it wasn't just physical labor. Enslaved people were scribes, chefs, doctors, accountants, concubines, and gladiators. Some even became wealthy. A few bought their freedom. But the majority, no names recorded, just labor. Invisible gears in the Roman machine. The contradiction is hard to ignore. The same civilization that gave us republican ideals, civic order, and architectural wonders also gave us mass exploitation and systemic cruelty, which is a fancy way of saying Rome was complicated, very impressive, and very terrible. But back to the visible parts, the parts Rome liked to brag about. One of the most visible and frankly weirdest parts of Roman public life was entertainment. They didn't just build stadiums, they built spectacles. The Colosseum wasn't just an arena, it was a statement. It told the world, we can engineer bloodshed, and we can seat 50,000 people to watch it, and still have time for snacks. You'd think the novelty of two men stabbing each other in front of a screaming crowd would wear off. It didn't. For centuries, gladiator games were a cornerstone of Roman leisure. And before you ask, no, it wasn't always to the death. Gladiators were expensive, trained professionals, sometimes celebrities. But other times? Yeah, it got real. Especially if the performers were prisoners, condemned criminals, or just unlucky captives from that one city the legions sacked last spring. And if the morning show wasn't exciting enough, don't worry, there were wild animal hunts. Exotic creatures from all corners of the empire dragged into the arena, mostly confused, mostly angry, and occasionally given a spear to spice things up. The crowd loved it. It was violent, messy, over the top, and completely normalized. You go to the Colosseum like we go to the movies. Pack a snack. Find your seat. Cheer for your favorite fighter. And then go home and talk about it over dinner like it was just another Tuesday. And here's the most Roman part of all. They thought this was civilization. That public execution as entertainment was just part of the social order. That spectacle and power went hand in hand. And that as long as the aqueducts flowed and the baths steamed, the people would be happy. And for a while, they were right. But empires don't last forever. And next, we'll slowly drift into the part where Rome starts, forgetting how to hold itself together. Cracks in the marble. When Rome started forgetting it was Rome, let's settle in again. The aqueducts still flow. The roads are still straight. The Colosseum still echoes with yesterday's applause. But something is off. Rome, for all its infrastructure, glory, and swagger, is starting to slip, not all at once. There's no dramatic collapse. It's more like watching an old villa slowly rot while the owners keep repainting the door. The problems start from the inside, and mostly from the top. See, the Roman Empire had become enormous, too big to rule easily, stretching from Scotland to Syria, with dozens of languages, cultures, and local gods who were all expected to somehow get along under a single emperor. Spoiler, they didn't. But the emperors tried. Oh, they tried. They reorganized provinces. They raised taxes. They minted more coins, which of course led to inflation because even Romans couldn't cheat the economy forever. A loaf of bread went from a few coins to a wheelbarrow full of, this is still legal, silver-plated tokens. And the army? The army was everywhere. Which sounds good, until you realize it cost a fortune to maintain. Roman legions had to be paid, fed, equipped, and regularly reminded not to kill their own commanders. And because actual Romans weren't super into dying for the empire anymore, generals started recruiting non-Roman mercenaries, soldiers from Germanic tribes, from the east, from wherever they could find strong arms and sharp spears. It worked until it didn't, because these new soldiers didn't always fight for Rome. Sometimes they fought for themselves. Sometimes they marched on Rome itself. And sometimes they just quietly waited until the moment was right and took over. But we're not there yet. Let's drift back a little to one of the few emperors who actually tried to slow the bleeding. His name was Diocletian. If Rome had therapists, Diocletian would have been the emperor who finally admitted, okay, we have a problem. He took power in 284 CE and immediately decided that one man can't rule this mess alone. So he came up with a solution that only someone buried in scrolls and stress would invent: the tetrarchy. 4 emperors. 2 senior, 2 junior. 1 for each quarter of the empire. It was kind of like group therapy, but with swords. And for a minute, it worked. Diocletian also reformed the tax system, froze prices, standardized coinage, and, in true Roman fashion, cracked down on Christians again, because every emperor eventually panicked and blamed the nearest minority for the empire's spiritual bad vibes. Eventually, Diocletian did something no one expected. He retired, actually moved to a villa in what's now Croatia, grew cabbages, and ignored everyone who begged him to return. When asked about ruling again, he supposedly said, "If you saw my garden, you wouldn't ask me." Honestly, relatable. But the tetrarchy didn't last, because Rome's real addiction wasn't to expansion or conquest. It was civil war. Almost immediately, the 4 emperors started turning on each other. Allies became enemies. Juniors became seniors. Seniors became corpses. It was like a gladiator match, but with more titles and fewer helmets. Out of the chaos rose one man. He'd been watching, waiting, biding his time. His name? Constantine, and he wasn't just going to rule the empire. He was going to rewrite it. But we'll glide into that revelation next. Because right now, Rome is still flickering. Not collapsing. Not yet. Just flickering. Like the last coals in a fire that used to warm the entire world. Constantine and the Empire of Light and slight rebranding, the empire was wobbling. 1 foot in tradition, the other on a pile of civil wars, inflation, and spiritual confusion. And right as everything seemed like it might quietly fall apart, a man named Constantine saw a sign. Now, whether this sign was a literal celestial vision or just a very dramatic daydream, we'll never know. But according to later Christian sources, before a crucial battle, Constantine looked up at the sky and saw a cross, along with the words, "In this sign, conquer," which is one of the more intense motivational messages to come from the clouds. This was the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. In 312 CE, Constantine was fighting for control of the western half of the empire. His rival, Maxentius, was camped near Rome, probably feeling pretty confident. Constantine had his soldiers paint Christian symbols on their shields, a move that was either a calculated PR stunt or a sincere religious pivot. Or knowing Roman politics, both. And when the dust settled, Maxentius was dead. Constantine was victorious, and the empire had just changed direction, quietly, but permanently. Before this, Christianity had been a nuisance to the Roman state. Something strange, Eastern, disruptive, the kind of thing emperors tried to stamp out, especially when plagues were bad or the gods seemed too quiet. But Constantine flipped the script. In 313 CE, just a year after his victory, he issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity. Not declaring it the official religion, not yet, but making it safe. No more burnings. No more lions. No more underground catacombs. Suddenly, Christianity could come out into the sunlight, and it did, very quickly. Constantine gave land to churches, money to bishops, and, importantly, power to those who supported the new regime. Christian leaders were elevated. Pagan temples weren't shut down, but they stopped being the empire's favorite child. Now, was Constantine actually a devout Christian? That's debatable. He wasn't baptized until he was on his deathbed, which, to be fair, was a popular move back then. The logic being, save all your sins till the end, then cash out with a full spiritual cleanse. Efficient. What we do know is this: Constantine was a skilled politician, and he understood that religion wasn't just belief. It was infrastructure. It unified, it commanded loyalty, and most importantly, it could be used to hold an empire together when armies and taxes weren't enough. He also realized something else. Rome, the city, was past its prime. By the 4th century, it was overcrowded, chaotic, and a little too proud of its own legacy. Like an aging celebrity who insists they're still relevant while their villa is literally crumbling. So Constantine looked east, toward Byzantium, an ancient Greek port town with a nice view of the Bosporus. And there, he began building a new capital, a fresh, gleaming city, full of monuments, walls, forums, churches, a city that could be the new Rome without all the inconvenient memories of stabbed senators and flaming temples. He named it Constantinople. Of course he did. It became the heart of the Eastern Empire. Strategically placed, wealthy, cosmopolitan, and, most importantly, defensible. It would outlive Rome itself by over 1,000 years. Now, Constantine wasn't just building cities and backing bishops. He was also trying to fix theology. Because Christianity, by the 4th century, was already busy arguing with itself about doctrine, about the nature of Christ, about what even counted as Christian. So in 325 CE, Constantine called the Council of Nicaea, a gathering of bishops from across the empire. The goal? Unity? The result? A creed, a declaration of beliefs. And a few excommunications because unity is hard. The council didn't fix everything, of course, but it marked a turning point. Christianity was no longer a rebellious fringe movement. It was now imperial business, with robes, with titles, with tax breaks. It was Rome, but with crosses. Constantine died in 337 CE after over 3 decades of rule. He left behind an empire still divided, still fragile, but unmistakably transformed. His sons would carry on the dynasty, some better than others. But the direction was clear. The gods of Olympus were fading, and a new kind of emperor was rising, one who ruled not just with a sword, but with scripture. It wouldn't all be peaceful, or even coherent. But Rome's identity had changed. It wasn't just Latin, marble, and Jupiter anymore. It was incense, icons, and a growing bureaucracy of bishops. The old gods had retreated to myths and temples, and in their place stood something more organized, more moralistic, and, depending on who you asked, just as terrifying. The East and West go to couples counseling, and never come back. Rome was always proud of being one empire, one world, one identity, but after Constantine, that illusion was on life support. Because while the emperors still claimed to rule everything, it had become painfully obvious that trying to govern Britain and Syria from the same desk was not ideal. So, without much ceremony, the empire gradually slipped into a sort of split custody arrangement. 2 emperors, one in the west, one in the east. They were supposed to work together, share policies, watch each other's borders, send friendly letters. Instead, they mostly ignored each other, like co-workers who technically share a project but haven't replied to each other's emails in 3 years. The Eastern Empire, based in Constantinople, had all the advantages: wealth, trade, geography, not being next to angry Germanic tribes. It was urban, educated, and defended by some of the best walls ever built. Seriously, Theodosian walls. 3 layers of "try me" in stone and brick. Meanwhile, the Western Empire was struggling. Rome was no longer the capital. That honor bounced around between Milan, Ravenna, and whoever still had running water that week. Its economy was faltering. Its armies were increasingly filled with mercenaries. Its infrastructure was slowly crumbling under the weight of neglect, war, and general imperial burnout. And the emperors? They weren't exactly inspiring confidence. At best, you got a tired administrator pretending not to see the disaster outside. At worst, you got children on the throne, literal children, being manipulated by warlords, uncles, and palace eunuchs. One of the last halfway decent emperors in the West was Theodosius I. He reigned in the late 4th century and was the last emperor to rule over both East and West, technically. He spent most of his time in the East, but hey, credit where it's due. He was a Christian hardliner, which meant he took all the imperial favoritism Constantine started and turned it up to 11. Pagan temples were closed. Sacrifices were banned. The old gods were now illegal roommates, hiding in dusty corners of the culture. And when rioting broke out in Thessalonica, because this was Rome and someone was always rioting, Theodosius responded with what we will generously call an overreaction. Thousands were killed. The massacre shocked even the church. Bishop Ambrose of Milan, in an early and surprisingly spicy example of church-state tension, publicly scolded the emperor and demanded penance. And Theodosius actually did it. He wore sackcloth. He prayed. He wept. He admitted he may have slightly overdone the whole mass murder thing. It was weirdly wholesome. But Theodosius died in 395 CE, and when he did, the East and West split again, this time permanently. And things in the West? They went downhill faster than a chariot with one wheel. Let's pause for a moment here. Because what's happening isn't a dramatic collapse. It's not one big moment. It's a slow fade. Like when someone falls asleep mid-conversation and just starts muttering about tax reforms and barley shipments. The army is underfunded. The borders are porous. The emperors are weak. And the people in charge of fixing all this? Too busy fighting each other over titles that don't mean anything anymore. And then, like a thunderclap in slow motion, Alaric arrives. He is the king of the Visigoths, one of many so-called barbarian tribes who had once fought against Rome, then fought for Rome, and now weren't sure whether Rome was friend, employer, or true toy. Alaric had served as a Roman general. He knew how the system worked, and he knew that the empire was vulnerable. He wanted a secure position, land for his people, a permanent place in the system. Rome said no, so in 410 CE he invaded. And for the first time in 800 years, the city of Rome, the eternal city, the sacred heart of the empire, was sacked. It wasn't a complete destruction. Alaric was relatively polite by ancient sacking standards. Churches were spared. Most of the population was left alive. Some looting, some chaos, sure. But not the bloodbath you might expect. Still, the psychological damage was immense. People couldn't believe it. Rome had fallen. The world didn't end, but something cracked. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, said it best. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. The West didn't recover. Alaric died soon after, his grave supposedly buried under a diverted river to keep it hidden. The Visigoths moved on, eventually settling in Spain. But they left Rome changed, exposed. The imperial mask was slipping, and more tribes were watching. Over the next few decades, Rome's western provinces were picked apart like a tired buffet. The Vandals crossed from Spain into North Africa and set up their own kingdom. They even built a navy and became the terror of the Mediterranean, which was deeply off-brand for a people whose name would eventually become synonymous with spray-painting train stations. The Huns showed up too, led by Attila, a man so feared that Roman children were probably told bedtime stories that started with, "Go to sleep or Attila will burn your village." He raided both east and west, demanded tribute, and nearly sacked Rome itself. The only thing that stopped him was a diplomatic meeting with Pope Leo I, who either talked Attila down or paid him off. Historians disagree. Either way, Attila turned back. And then, bizarrely, he died of a nosebleed on his wedding night, which, if you're into poetic justice, is deeply satisfying. Meanwhile, the Roman government in the West was mostly theater. The emperors were figureheads, puppets of Germanic generals who ran the army and called the shots. There were still official coins, still titles, still a Senate writing letters to itself. But the empire was dead on its feet. All that was left was the moment someone finally turned off the lights. We'll float gently toward that moment next. Because Rome, for all its legacy, was now a memory wrapped in ceremony, slowly dissolving into the hands of people who didn't need the empire, just the land it used to own. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was more of a brand than a functioning state. It still had emperors, technically, but most of them were either children, hostages, or highly decorative adults whose main job was standing still in mosaics while someone else made all the decisions. The real power sat with the generals, especially generals with exotic names and large personal armies. These were usually not Roman-born. Most were Germanic or Hunnic or some other shade of definitely not from Latium, and they commanded troops who didn't care much for the Senate, the emperor, or Latin grammar. One of the more notorious power players was Flavius Aetius, a military commander who practically ran the Western Empire like a private company. He was competent, ruthless, and fluent in dealing with chaos. And chaos was pretty much the default setting by this point. Barbarians weren't just raiding anymore. They were moving in, building kingdoms, intermarrying with local elites, and asking very reasonable questions like, so, why are we still pretending Rome is in charge? Aetius spent much of his career fighting Attila the Hun. Yes, that Attila. The one who kept threatening to level cities unless you sent him gold, horses, or your daughter, preferably all three. In 451, Aetius famously defeated Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in Gaul, sort of. It was more of a draw with heavy casualties, but Rome claimed victory anyway, because at this point, good PR was worth more than a stable border. 2 years later, Attila marched into Italy anyway. He approached Rome. People panicked. The imperial court, such as it was, trembled behind city walls. And then, somehow, Pope Leo I, a man with absolutely no military power, convinced Attila to turn around and leave. Maybe he paid him off, maybe he guilt-tripped him, maybe Attila just got bored and missed his tent. Either way, Rome survived another near-death experience by the skin of its well-oiled aqueducts. Of course, within a year, Attila was dead. Internal bleeding, a possible burst artery, maybe alcohol poisoning, maybe a severe nosebleed. The cause isn't clear. What is clear is that his death broke the back of the Hunnic threat. His sons fought each other, his empire fractured, and the Roman world exhaled, shakily, but still breathing. That breathing didn't last long. In 455, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals. Remember them? They'd set up shop in North Africa, which, by the way, had been Rome's breadbasket for centuries. The Vandals now controlled grain production, the fleet, and just enough firepower to sail directly to Rome and help themselves to whatever was left. They didn't destroy the city. Not entirely. But they were very, very thorough. Hence the word vandalism. Rome was looted, defiled, and left looking like someone had rearranged it with a crowbar. By now, the emperor was a man named Petronius Maximus. Not a name anyone remembers fondly. He was emperor for 70-something days. That's not a joke. He took the throne in March and was dead by May, killed by an angry mob while trying to flee the city in a panic. His body was torn to pieces and thrown in the Tiber. Even by Roman standards, that was a fast turnaround. After that, emperors came and went like guests at a cursed dinner party. Avitus, Majorian, Libius Severus, each one with a fancy name and about as much real authority as a broken sundial. Most were puppets of the military or placeholders until the next coup. Some tried to reform things. One even attempted a tax overhaul. But by then, the machinery of government was so rusted and sabotaged that pushing new policies through was like trying to fix a collapsing aqueduct with chewing gum. And then finally we arrive at the end. The last emperor of the Western Roman Empire was a boy, a teenager. His name was Romulus Augustus, though history, with its usual passive-aggressive flair, remembers him as Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus. The symbolism is hard to ignore. Romulus, like the mythical founder of Rome. Augustus, like the empire's first true emperor. All wrapped up in one polite, powerless child with no army, no money, and no chance. It was like watching the ghost of Rome play dress-up. He was installed by his father, Orestes, a general who had served under Attila the Hun, and then decided that he might as well crown his own son and run things behind the curtain. It wasn't the first time a military dad had done this. It would be the last. In 476 CE, Another general, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, decided he was done playing pretend. His troops were tired of being underpaid. The empire owed them land, promises had been made. Rome had no money and no leverage. So Odoacer marched into Ravenna, the imperial capital at the time, and deposed the emperor. Romulus Augustulus wasn't executed. That would have been too dramatic and frankly too expensive. Instead, he was sent into retirement, given a pension, allowed to live in comfort more or less. A quiet, pitiful ending for the last man to wear the imperial purple in the West. And that was it. There was no ceremony. No marble curtain falling, no final Senate vote. Just a boy taken off the throne, and a letter sent to Constantinople saying, "We don't need an emperor in the West anymore. One is enough." The Eastern Roman Empire, also known now as the Byzantine Empire, kept going for a very long time. 1,000 more years, in fact. But Rome, the original Rome, the Senate and people of Rome, SPQR, the legions, the triumphs, the Latin-speaking marble machine that had ruled the Mediterranean, was gone. The Western Roman Empire ended not with a final battle or a heroic last stand, but with a shrug, a whimper. A tired footnote written by people who couldn't pay the scribe on time. What came next was a mosaic of kingdoms. The Ostrogoths ruled Italy. The Visigoths ruled Spain. The Franks took over Gaul. The Vandals still had North Africa, though not for much longer. The Church grew in power. Latin slowly splintered into French, Spanish, Italian, languages that sounded like Rome but weren't quite. The roads crumbled. The baths closed. The aqueducts dried up. The Senate kept meeting for a while, talking to itself in echoing halls. But Rome had ended. Not as a city, it would survive. Not as a people, they still lived there. But as an idea of empire, of order, of one world under one rule, that was gone. And yet, Rome never really dies. It becomes an accent, a shape in a courthouse, a word in a textbook. A column standing alone in a wheat field. It lives in language, in law, in architecture, in the layout of cities, in the names of planets, in the way we still speak of republics and empires as if those things didn't begin under a hot Italian sun, guarded by wolves and superstition. Romulus Augustulus didn't know he was ending an era. No one ever does. That's the thing about history. It slips by quietly, and only later do we realize we were living in the closing credits. But if you listen carefully, in the stone and dust, you can still hear Rome whispering to itself. And maybe that's the real legacy, not power, not conquest, but endurance. After the West had its quiet funeral, a dethroned boy, a shrug from Constantinople, and a lot of confused senators staring at each other, the East just kept going. No dramatic collapse. No burning cities. Just another Tuesday in Constantinople, where the palace was still functioning, the court was still scheming, and the emperor was still convinced that, technically, he ruled the entire Roman world, including the half that had just stopped existing. The Eastern Roman Empire, or what modern people call the Byzantine Empire, didn't think of itself as Byzantine. That's a later invention. They called themselves Romans. They called their empire Rome. They wrote their tax codes in Latin for a while. And then, like any tired empire, they just switched to Greek and pretended they'd always done that. If you'd walk through Constantinople in the 5th or 6th century, you'd still feel it. The Roman nests, the arches, the aqueducts, the triumphal columns. The grumpy administrators trying to explain why grain quotas still hadn't been met in Egypt. But it wasn't the same Rome. It was more careful, more Christian, more ceremonial. Less wine-fueled conquest and more incense, gold-threaded robes, and very long church services. They had emperors, yes. But by now, the emperor wasn't a general with mud on his boots. He was a sacred figure, God's chosen. Crowned by bishops, surrounded by eunuchs. Held up by bureaucracy, tradition, and the sheer weight of institutional memory. And the emperor who truly embraced this new identity, who tried to be both Caesar and saint, was Justinian I. He, ruled from 527 to 565 CE, and he was a man with visions. Big ones. He wanted to restore the old empire, rebuild what had been lost, clean up the law codes, redesign the skyline, and also argue with heretics, micromanage his generals, and nearly bankrupt the state with building projects. So, a multitasker. Justinian was born in a village in what's now North Macedonia. He wasn't royal, but his uncle became emperor first, and Justinian climbed up behind him. And once he had the throne, he went to work like someone who'd been making imperial to-do lists since childhood. The biggest item on his list? Reconquest. Because despite all the speeches about Christian virtue and spiritual authority, Justinian still wanted Italy back. And North Africa. And maybe Spain. All the western territories that had been lost to those pesky barbarian kingdoms, who kept insisting they were legitimate rulers now. So he sent his best general, Belisarius, a man who honestly deserves his own bedtime story, if only for the sheer amount of betrayal he put up with. Belisarius reconquered North Africa from the Vandals in a matter of months. Then he sailed to Italy, fought the Ostrogoths, took Rome, lost it, took it again, lost it again, and eventually handed the whole mess back to the empire, only slightly on fire. It worked, sort of. For a brief, flickering moment, Justinian's empire stretched further than it had in 100 years. Rome, the city, was Romain again, at least on paper. But the cost was enormous. The treasury was drained. The army was exhausted. And the territories kept slipping away as soon as the legions packed up. Meanwhile, back in Constantinople, Justinian was busy with another project, one far more permanent. In 532 CE, after a major riot, the Nika riots burned half the city. Justinian responded not by quitting or apologizing or maybe listening to the mob. No, he built a church. Not just any church, the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. It was massive, domed, gold-covered, echoing with chanting. A cosmic symbol of imperial and divine power all rolled into one architectural flex. And it worked. For centuries, the Hagia Sophia stood as the heart of Christian Rome in the East, until, of course, it became a mosque, then a museum, then a mosque again. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Justinian's other big legacy, besides bankrupting the empire and nearly firing Belisarius every other Tuesday, was law. He commissioned the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. It was a compilation of centuries of Roman legal thinking, sorted, simplified, and reorganized for a new era. And while it probably made a lot of lawyers cry at the time, it ended up becoming the foundation of much of modern Western legal systems. So the next time you read a contract and want to scream, remember, some Roman bureaucrat was probably screaming first, 1,500 years ago. But for all his ambition, Justinian couldn't stop the future. After he died in 565, things started to fray. Again, the plagues came, the frontiers crumbled, the empire shrank. Persia attacked. Then Islam rose from the south, spreading across former Roman territories like wildfire. In a few short decades, the empire lost Syria, Egypt, and North Africa forever. By the 7th century, Constantinople was hanging on by its walls, and they did hang on, time and again. The city was besieged, bombarded, blockaded, and it survived. With Greek fire, strong walls, and a deeply unhealthy sense of imperial pride. The Eastern Roman Empire kept going, smaller, stranger, speaking Greek, praying in domes instead of temples, still calling itself Roman, still believing it was the last light of civilization in a darkening world. And in some ways, it was. But that's a story for another long night. Because even as the Western Empire became legend, marble ruins, and Latin textbooks, the East was writing a 1,000-year sequel. It wouldn't end with glory. But it wouldn't go quietly either. We'll drift into that twilight next. By the 7th century, the Eastern Roman Empire had stopped pretending it was anything close to the old empire of Augustus. It was smaller, stranger, wrapped in silk instead of bronze. and more obsessed with court rituals than with legions. But it was still there. Constantinople was still the capital. The emperor still sat on a throne. And Roman law, Roman titles, Roman arrogance, all still lingered like incense in a smoky basilica. And yet it was changing. The people now spoke Greek, not Latin. The government used new words. The culture was more Christian than Roman, and while the emperors still called themselves Augustus or Basileus, their crowns had become heavier, more symbolic than practical. This new Rome didn't rule the world. It simply tried to survive it, which, given the circumstances, was kind of impressive. The empire faced pressure from every direction. To the east, the Persians were still around, because apparently history wasn't done recycling rivalries. The two empires, Roman and Persian, had been bickering over Armenia, Syria, and who had the nicer palace since the days of Caesar. Then came something new. In the 7th century, a new power rose out of the Arabian Peninsula, fast, fervent, and organized. The early Islamic caliphates exploded across the map with a speed that made even veteran empires blink. Within just a few decades, they had taken Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Persia, and North Africa, territories the Romans had held for centuries. It was a shock. The Byzantines, as we now tend to call them, were stunned. The cities they lost weren't just provinces. They were foundational. Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, ancient Roman metropolises, gone almost overnight. And yet Constantinople held. It was besieged multiple times. Arab fleets surrounded it. Armies camped outside its walls. But the city, perched between two continents, wrapped in those famous Theodosian walls, refused to fall, partly because of clever defense, partly because of Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary weapon that burned even on water. Think of it as ancient napalm, shot from tubes on the decks of ships. No one outside the empire quite understood how it worked. Honestly, no one inside the empire really understood either. But it worked. The empire held on, shrunk, rebranded again, shifted priorities. By the 8th and 9th centuries, Byzantium was no longer pretending to restore Rome. That dream had expired. Instead, they doubled down on theology, on bureaucracy, on the art of survival through very aggressive moderation. Emperors came and went, often after being blinded, exiled, or mysteriously poisoned. There were palace coups, military uprisings, monks yelling about icons, and more dynastic intrigue than an entire season of historical drama could cover. And yet, somehow, the machine kept turning. In the 10th and 11th centuries, under emperors like Basil II, the empire even regained a little swagger. Basil, known as the Bulgar Slayer, a name that tells you everything you need to know about Byzantine branding, reconquered territory, filled the treasury, and scared his enemies into compliance. For a brief moment, Constantinople glittered again. Merchants flocked to its markets. Pilgrims came to see its churches. Diplomats stood awkwardly in its throne room, trying not to blink too much while the emperor's eunuchs explained protocol number 97C. It was, if not a golden age, at least a very shiny silver one. But empires don't pause. They creak forward, or they fracture. In 1054, the empire faced a different kind of split, not political, but spiritual, the Great Schism. The moment the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church officially broke up. They'd been arguing for centuries, of course, about doctrine, about liturgy, about whether priests could have beards. But in 1054, it became official. The Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople excommunicated each other. So now, not only was Rome divided east and west politically, but the church itself had divorced. It was awkward, and it got worse, because in 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, which was supposed to march on Jerusalem, a bunch of Christian knights from Western Europe decided, for complicated and greedy reasons, to sack Constantinople instead. Yes, the capital of the Christian Roman Empire was looted, burned, and defiled by other Christians. Not Muslims, not Persians, Crusaders, allegedly in the name of God. It was one of the most catastrophic betrayals in medieval history. The churches were stripped of gold, the palaces ransacked, sacred relics stolen and shipped to Venice. Even the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral of Justinian, was desecrated, animals slaughtered on its altars, icons destroyed. The empire was broken. For a few decades, Constantinople was ruled by Latin kings who had no idea what they were doing. Eventually, the Byzantines took it back in 1261, but it was a shadow of its former self, weakened, diminished, hollowed out, and waiting. Because just across the water, something new was rising. Something faster, younger, hungrier. The Ottoman Turks. And this time, there would be no miraculous survival. Let me know when you're ready to drift into part 15, the final siege, and the actual fall of Constantinople. It had withstood Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Crusaders, and its own emperors. It had lost provinces, armies, and credibility, but somehow never lost itself. It was tired, yes. It had shrunk. Its palaces were fading. Its coins were increasingly theoretical. Its bureaucracy was held together with wax seals and stubbornness. But the city still stood. By the early 1400s, however, it was clear that the end was approaching, slowly, then all at once. The empire, by this point, was a sliver, a whisper of its former self. Constantinople, a few scattered territories in Greece, some loyal forts, and not much else, surrounded by enemies, dependent on broken promises from the West, and entirely reliant on walls that had already lived several lifetimes. And just across the water, the Ottomans were watching. They'd been rising steadily for over a century, expanding, modernizing, learning from the Mongols, the Arabs, even from the Byzantines themselves. They had cavalry, infantry, gunpowder, and, most importantly, time. In 1451, a new sultan came to power, Mehmed II. He was 19 years old, ambitious, educated, fluent in multiple languages including Greek, and he had one very specific goal, to take Constantinople. Not just for glory, not just for expansion, but to become the man who ended Rome, so he began to prepare. He built a massive fortress, Rumeli Hazari, just north of the city on the Bosporus, right across from an older fortress on the opposite bank. Together, they controlled the strait. Nothing could pass without Ottoman permission. It was a message. A quiet siege before the real one. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos did what he could. He rallied the people, fortified the walls, begged the West, again, for help. A few Italians came. Some ships arrived, but not nearly enough. Western Europe, once again, had other problems, other priorities. Or perhaps they just thought Constantinople had cheated death too many times already. By April 1453, Mehmed's army, over 80,000 men, surrounded the city. Constantinople's defenders? And then came the cannons. Mehmed had hired an engineer, Orban, a Hungarian, to build the biggest artillery anyone had ever seen. Massive bombards that fired stone balls the size of wine barrels. They weren't accurate, and they took hours to reload, but when they hit, the walls shook. The siege began. It lasted 53 days. Day after day, cannon fire pounded the Theodosian walls. The defenders rushed to patch holes, to rebuild towers, to pray. Night after night, the Ottomans dug tunnels, probed for weak spots, and kept the pressure on. Inside the city, morale collapsed and rose again in waves. One minute, a miracle seemed possible. The next, the cracks showed in the stone and in the people. And then, on May 29th, in the pre-dawn darkness, Mehmed launched a full assault. Wave after wave of soldiers crashed against the battered walls. First the expendable troops, then the more seasoned ones. And finally, the Janissaries, elite infantry, raised from childhood to be the Sultan's blade. The defenders held. Until they didn't. One section of the wall, near the Kirkoporta gate, was breached. Maybe it had been left unlocked. Maybe it collapsed under pressure. No one really knows. What we do know is that the Ottomans poured in, and then it was over. Emperor Constantine XI was last seen throwing off his imperial regalia and charging into battle. He died with his soldiers. His body was never conclusively identified. The last Roman emperor died on his feet, defiant, forgotten, immortal. Mehmed entered the city on horseback. He ordered that the churches be spared, most of them. Some were looted, some converted. But he walked into the Hagia Sophia, stood beneath its dome, and claimed the city for Islam, for the Ottomans and for himself. He called himself Kaiser-i-Rom, Caesar of Rome, because the dream hadn't died. It had just changed hands. The empire that had begun with Augustus, that had survived the Goths, the Huns, the plague, Charlemagne, and the Crusades, finally ended. On May 29, 1453, Rome, the real Rome, the state that began in a muddy Italian village and ruled the world, was dead. After more than 2,200 years, and yet the shadow of Rome still lingers. In the domes of Istanbul, in the words of our laws, in the roads beneath modern cities, in the Latin words etched on old coins and new mottos. It never really went away. It just changed names. It just changed gods. It just became something new. Something no longer Roman, but still shaped by Rome, because that's the thing about empires. They fall, but they leave footprints. Long after the last emperor is gone. So, Rome is gone, but of course it's not. Because Rome, unlike most empires, didn't just leave behind ruins. It left behind a full-blown identity crisis for the next 1,000 years. Let's start with the most obvious copycat, the Holy Roman Empire. Ah yes, that charming medieval chimera. Not Roma, not holy, barely an empire. But someone clearly needed a rebrand. Founded by Charlemagne in 800 AD. Technically, before the fall of Constantinople, the Holy Roman Empire was Western Europe. S attempt at keeping the Roman name alive, even if it had no idea what Rome actually meant anymore. The emperors wore crowns, held scepters, and occasionally made big speeches in Latin, though usually very bad Latin. They got crowned by the Pope, marched around with banners, and imagined themselves as Caesar reborn. In practice, the Holy Roman Empire was just a political spaghetti bowl of feuding German princes, stubborn bishops and emperors who ruled in theory but spent most of their time begging cities for taxes. Still, the name Roman stuck. Because apparently once you slap that on your business card, people listen, or at least nod politely. Then there's Russia. After the fall of Constantinople, the Russian czars, literally, Caesars, declared that Moscow was the third Rome. First Rome fell. Second Rome, Constantinople, fell. But now, by divine fate, the torch had passed to them. The Russians married into the Byzantine imperial family, adopted the double-headed eagle, built onion-domed cathedrals, and stared into the snowy distance with prophetic gloom. They inherited the Eastern Orthodox faith and the imperial mood, and they never let go of the idea that Rome's destiny was somehow still unfolding in the frost. Meanwhile, over in the actual city of Rome, the original one, not the spiritual sequels, the Catholic Church had moved in and made itself very comfortable. The Pope now ruled the Papal States, wore outfits that would make Augustus blush, and commissioned architecture that blended Roman columns with Christian iconography. St. Peter's Basilica, the Vatican, the Sistine Chapel, all built in the ruins, rising from the ashes like a gospel-singing phoenix. So now Rome was holy again, but with less stabbing and more incense. And that's just the spiritual legacy. Let's talk language. If you're reading this script in English, congratulations, you've already absorbed a chunk of Latin without realizing it. English is basically a Germanic base layered with Latin sprinkles like a linguistic sundae. Words like emperor, senator, forum, justice, military, civilian, public, private, capital, and decimate, all Roman. French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. They're not just inspired by Latin. They are Latin, evolved, slurred, modernized, but still whispering the Roman tongue. Even legal systems today still echo Roman law, the idea of contracts, of written codes, of innocent until proven guilty, of property rights, wills, and court proceedings. Rome may have lost its empire, but it lawyered its way into eternity. Then there's architecture, domes, arches, colonnades, public fountains, giant government buildings designed to make you feel small. Yeah, Rome again. From Washington, D.C. to Paris to London to Berlin and back to Rome itself, cities across the world have borrowed, copied, or outright stolen the Roman aesthetic. It's not democracy unless it's got a few Corinthian columns and an eagle statue out front. Even the word Senate got recycled. The U.S. Senate, the French Roman titles got dusted off and reused because they sound official, even when the politicians inside them are less than imperial. And let's not forget calendars. You're living in Julius Caesar's calendar right now. It is called the Gregorian calendar today, tweaked a little by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582, but its backbone is Roman. July? Named after Julius Augustus. March? Mars, the god of war. Thanks to Rome, we still structure time like a Roman administrator trying to organize grain shipments. And then there's the ultimate Roman export, the idea of an empire. Rome became the gold standard. Everyone wanted to be the next one. From Napoleon to Mussolini, from the British Empire to the American Republic, the language of Rome got wheeled out every time someone needed to justify expansion. Even America, the land of freedom and jazz, borrows heavily from Roman symbolism. Look at the U.S. Capitol building, the Latin mottos, the eagle, the Republican values, the Founding Fathers, the obsession with liberty and virtue and balance of power. It's all a remix of Cicero's greatest hits, with fewer togas and more powdered wigs. And that's the strange, lingering truth of Rome. It died. But also didn't. It became mythologized, a symbol more than a state. Its history became bedtime stories, cautionary tales, academic models, and inspiration for sci-fi world building. People still write books about how it fell, about how it could have survived, about how maybe it never really did fall. Because Rome wasn't just a place, it was a performance. A brand. A system of symbols so powerful, it kept running long after the last soldier left the walls. Empires fall. Cities burn. Statues crumble. But ideas? Ideas are slippery. Rome's idea was simple. Organize the chaos. Give it a name. Give it a senate. Maybe a bathhouse. And then expand until you forget why you started. And even now, long after the emperors are dust and the legions silent, we're still speaking Rome, thinking in Rome. We're in the shadow of a civilization that refused to fade. So here we are. We started with a tiny, swampy village in Italy, then followed it through republics and dictatorships, through roads and ruins, through Caesars, plagues and collapses, and somehow ended up in the modern world surrounded by echoes. Rome is gone, but its outline still lingers. It's in our governments, our laws, our architecture, our languages, our calendars, our coins, even our internet arguments about empire and decline. You can throw a metaphorical stone without hitting a Roman legacy, and they probably built the road you threw it from. But the more you study Rome, the more it becomes clear. It was never just about power. Yes, they conquered. Yes, they enslaved. Yes, they taxed and repressed and occasionally set people on fire for entertainment. But underneath all of that, Rome was trying to solve a problem. How do you organize people, like lots of people, from different cultures, different religions, different continents? How do you make them part of something shared, even when they don't speak the same language or trust each other? Rome's answer was pretty Roman. Build roads, issue coins, tax everyone, install a governor, and hope for the best. And it mostly worked until it didn't, until the weight of the system crushed the people inside it, until the borders outgrew the bureaucracy, until the emperors became paranoid, the soldiers disloyal, the climate unpredictable, the economy fragile, and the world too big for one city's name to hold, which is kind of relatable. We like to think we've evolved, that we've learned from Rome's mistakes, that our empires, economic, digital, global, are smarter, kinder, more sustainable. And yet, we still burn out. We still centralize too much power. We still confuse spectacle with substance. Still name things after dead men in marble. Still declare things eternal and act surprised when they crack. Because that's the Roman lesson no one likes to print on coinage. Everything breaks. Glory fades, statues topple. Governments collapse under their own spreadsheets. And yes, marble erodes, even when you thought it would last forever. But there's something kind of beautiful in that. Rome wasn't perfect. It wasn't even particularly good a lot of the time. It was violent, hypocritical, grandiose, and wildly inconsistent, but it was human. It tried to write laws, to build bridges, to understand the stars, to preserve knowledge, to bathe regularly, to write poetry and history and dirty graffiti on stone walls that somehow still survives. And in the end, that's what remains. Not the conquests, not the borders, not the emperors with their twitchy eyes and gold sandals, but the stories, the whispers carved in stone, the mosaics in dusty ruins, the scrolls someone copied by candlelight, the myths retold so many times we forgot they were real people, people like us, anxious, petty, hopeful, tired, trying to make sense of their world, just like we are. Trying to build something that might maybe last a little longer than they would. And sure, maybe they failed. Spectacularly even. But they also left us a roadmap, not a perfect one, but a haunting, fascinating, deeply flawed one. A reminder that civilizations aren't just made of stone and steel and Senate votes. They're made of moments, of conversations in marketplaces, of children learning the alphabet on wax tablets, of soldiers missing home, of scholars dreaming of the stars, of someone lighting an oil lamp one last time before the city goes dark. That's Rome. Not just an empire. Not just a myth, but a mirror, one we keep staring into, trying to understand who we were, and maybe who we still are. So, if you've made it this far, congratulations. You've just wandered through 2,000 years of ambition, failure, resilience, and deeply impractical architecture. You've met emperors who burned cities, senators who plotted endlessly and still got nowhere, generals who tried to save the world and only made it worse, and a whole cast of humans who just kept going. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere in that sleepy marble labyrinth, you found a little piece of yourself. Because history doesn't repeat. It whispers, softly, in Latin,